It started like a whisper, faint and unthreatening, just a headline tucked beneath the fold of international business pages. Beijing unveils targeted tariffs in response to U.S. semiconductor restrictions. To casual observers, it seemed like another round in the long-standing trade skirmish between the world's two largest economies. But to those paying closer attention, investors, CEOs, farmers, truckers, it sounded like something far more dangerous, a shot fired in a new kind of war. Just 48 hours after President Trump doubled down on U.S. semiconductor export restrictions to China, claiming national security concerns and unfair trade practices, Beijing fired back. And this time, the blow was sharp, strategic, and devastating. China's retaliation came in 3 waves. Tariffs on critical agricultural imports. Export restrictions on rare earth elements. Cybersecurity investigations targeting major U.S. brands operating in China. And in a matter of days, the impact was being felt from Wall Street to Main Street. Chart increasing Wall Street's panic. The Dow Jones opened Monday down 700 points. Tech stocks were hit hardest. Nvidia, Intel, and AMD, already exposed from previous chip export curbs, saw billions evaporate in market value. American farmers, especially in the Midwest, watched helplessly as soybean and corn futures plunged. China had just slapped a 25% tariff on U.S. grain again. For Iowa and Nebraska farmers, déjà vu from the 2018 trade war returned with a vengeance. "Last time it almost broke me," said Tom Callahan, a third-generation farmer in Iowa. "Now I don't know if I can hold on." China's playbook, precision pain. This wasn't just a blanket response from Beijing, it was surgical. China targeted sectors where the U.S. was strongest but most vulnerable: chips, agriculture, and high-end consumer goods. It also imposed inspections and certifications on American companies operating in China, causing shipping delays and bureaucratic slowdowns that cost millions by the hour. Apple, Tesla, Starbucks, and Boeing, all giants with large China exposure, were suddenly dealing with massive regulatory headaches. And then came the move that shook the supply chain to its core. China announced it would restrict the export of rare earth elements used in semiconductor production, electric vehicle batteries, and advanced military systems. The market trembled. America was suddenly staring down a crisis. These minerals are used in virtually every modern device, from smartphones to fighter jets. While the U.S. has rare earth reserves, processing and refining capabilities have long been outsourced, mostly to China. United States. Washington's reaction. Inside the West Wing, an emergency economic task force was convened. President Trump, flanked by Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer and Treasury Secretary Larry Kudlow, addressed the nation. "We will not be bullied. America will produce, manufacture, and innovate at home. This is about sovereignty." But even within the administration, voices of caution rose. Not everyone believed China would blink first. And across Capitol Hill, business leaders began lobbying hard for de-escalation. Still, the sentiment on the street was clear. This wasn't just a trade dispute. It was the beginning of a cold economic war. By midweek, the effects of China's retaliation had trickled down from boardrooms to store shelves, and the panic was no longer just on Wall Street. It was now in warehouses, logistics hubs, and living rooms across America. The average consumer may not have understood the nuances of semiconductor licensing or rare earth export quotas, but they felt it. Prices started rising. Shipments stalled. Products disappeared. Package the domino effect. America's supply chain has long relied on just-in-time delivery models, ultra-efficient systems built for speed and scale. A single disruption in one country could ripple through dozens of industries. What China had done was unleash a wave of strategic blockades, hitting these supply chains at their most vulnerable points. Electronics manufacturing stalled. U.S. companies like Dell, HP, and Apple faced delays of up to 3 to 4 weeks on components that were previously shipped within days. Retailers scrambled to restock basic goods, everything from air conditioners to smartphone chargers to toys for the summer season. Automotive giants in Michigan and Ohio reported slowdowns as EV battery components and microchips went into critical shortage. John Clark, a warehouse manager in Los Angeles, explained it best. "We used to have a 5-day buffer. Now we're running on fumes. Our whole operation is in chaos." Main Street pain. In stores, consumers were seeing unusual price jumps. A $499 laptop was now $549. A box of electronics cables jumped from $9.99 to $13.99. Even air fryers, the pandemic kitchen craze, suddenly cost $30 more. Retailers passed these costs on to consumers, but many didn't realize it wasn't inflation alone. It was retaliation. The National Retail Federation warned Congress in a formal letter. The trade war with China is putting enormous pressure on American consumers, small businesses, and manufacturers. The longer it goes, the worse it will get. And it wasn't just about prices. It was about jobs. Several small to mid-sized manufacturing plants that relied on Chinese parts were forced to pause operations. Layoffs followed. Workers in Indiana, Georgia, and Illinois began receiving pink slips not because their companies failed, but because their parts never arrived. Perhaps the most chilling consequence was in the world of chips. Without access to rare earths and critical intermediate semiconductors, U.S. tech firms had to halt entire product lines. AI firms paused development. EV makers cut their forecasts. Even the Department of Defense raised alarms over potential disruption to critical military hardware. One industry analyst described it as economic acupuncture. China didn't swing a hammer, they used a needle. They targeted pressure points. And we're feeling it across the system. The U.S. had made huge strides toward onshoring chip production. Intel broke ground on a $20 billion plant in Arizona. Taiwan Semiconductor began investing in U.S.-based fabrication. But these weren't overnight solutions. Most plants wouldn't go online until 2026 or later. India, Mexico, and the new outsourcing frontier. As China pulled away, American firms began looking elsewhere. Fast. Mexico became the go-to substitute for low-cost manufacturing. Indian IT firms reported a 300% surge in inquiries from U.S. corporations looking to diversify. Even Vietnam and Indonesia saw investment interest from American firms desperate to escape Chinese entanglement. But none of these countries could fully replace China's vast, skilled manufacturing ecosystem overnight. They were relief valves, not replacements. A strategic wake-up call. If anything, the chaos served as a wake-up call. For years, Washington policymakers talked about decoupling from China, but few truly understood how deeply intertwined both economies had become. Now, with Beijing tightening its grip, the cost of dependency was becoming painfully real. And yet, this was only the beginning. As the shockwaves of China's economic retaliation rippled through the U.S., analysts and political leaders began to realize something profound. This wasn't just tit-for-tat trade policy, it was a grand strategy. What Beijing had launched wasn't merely a reactive defense, it was an offensive calculated move aimed at reshaping global trade dynamics and exposing America's weaknesses. For the first time since the Cold War, the U.S. found itself in an economic standoff where its usual tools, tariffs, sanctions, and threats, had limited bite. The Chinese chessboard. Beijing's response revealed a long-term game plan that had likely been in development for years. Its goals were clear. Expose U.S. dependence on Chinese manufacturing and minerals. Undermine American consumer confidence by triggering shortages and price hikes. Attract investment into alternative trading blocs like BRICS Plus and position China as the centerpiece of a non-Western economic order. Xi Jinping, speaking at a recent BRICS conference, stated, "No nation should monopolize global value chains. The future belongs to multipolar trade, fair, balanced, and mutually respectful." Translation? Beijing was ready to lead a parallel economy separate from the West. China began deepening ties with Russia, Iran, and Brazil, offering trade deals in yuan rather than the US dollar. It also expanded its Belt and Road Initiative into parts of Latin America and Africa, promising infrastructure investments in exchange for loyalty. It was clear, China was building a coalition of the sanctioned and the sidelined, and it had the muscle to do it. United States. The US strikes back, but faces dilemmas. Back in Washington, President Trump took a hardline stance. "We will never allow China to hold our economy hostage. We will rebuild American supply chains and we will win." Congress raced to pass emergency legislation offering tax breaks for companies reshoring manufacturing and subsidies for rare earth production in states like California and Alaska. The Pentagon classified rare earth supply as a national security issue, funneling billions into mining and processing operations. But critics warned these measures wouldn't bear fruit for years. Meanwhile, American consumers, businesses, and workers were bearing the immediate brunt. And worse, some U.S. companies had built their entire business models around cheap Chinese labor, advanced factories, and shipping infrastructure. Pulling out would mean restructuring decades of logistics in a matter of months. The business exodus and the fear of retaliation. Some U.S. businesses tried to pivot quickly. Apple moved part of its assembly to India. Tesla accelerated its plans to open a new plant in Mexico. Walmart began sourcing from Southeast Asia. But each move came with friction and a fear that China could retaliate further. Would it seize American company assets in China? Restrict visas? Halt exports of critical components like lithium batteries? The risks loomed large. And many CEOs chose silence, afraid of being blacklisted in Beijing. Behind closed doors, however, panic was growing. Samantha Hill, a senior VP at a Fortune 500 electronics firm, confided to a journalist off the record. "We've been playing with fire for years. And now we're getting burned. But if we say it out loud, we lose access to 1 billion customers." Global supply chain reboot? The situation sparked a broader debate. Is globalization dead? For decades, businesses chased lower costs overseas. Countries became tightly connected in a web of production and trade. But now that web was showing cracks. And not just from China. Russia's war in Ukraine, the Red Sea shipping crisis, and pandemic bottlenecks had already stressed the system. What we were witnessing was a global recalibration. Governments were emphasizing economic resilience over efficiency. Companies were adopting a China plus one strategy, keeping China in the loop but not as the sole player. Investors began pouring capital into domestic manufacturing startups, betting on the return of Made in America. It was no longer about cheap or fast. It was now about secure, sustainable, and local. But it would take time. And during that time, America's economy would remain vulnerable. As the economic standoff between China and the U.S. intensified, the shockwaves extended beyond boardrooms and manufacturing floors. They slammed right into Washington, D.C. Suddenly, every speech, every political ad, every campaign promise revolved around one central theme: who can secure America's future in a world where China isn't playing nice anymore. And just like that, the 2025 political battlefield transformed into an economic war zone. The election takes a sharp turn. The Trump administration, now in its second term, seized on the crisis to double down on America First economic policies. Pam Bondi, now U.S. Attorney General, led fiery press conferences accusing China of economic sabotage. Meanwhile, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt fielded a packed press room daily, announcing swift executive orders, including accelerated tax breaks for domestic manufacturers, a new national strategic economic security task force, expanded tariffs on additional Chinese goods. President Trump, in a nationally televised address, declared, "We are ending the era of economic dependence. We are bringing jobs, factories, and freedom back home." His approval ratings among blue-collar workers soared. But across the aisle, the Democratic opposition painted a different picture. While they didn't deny the severity of the crisis, they argued that Trump's previous trade policies triggered the backlash in the first place. Senator Elizabeth Warren, speaking in a fiery Senate session, said, "You don't poke a dragon and act surprised when it breathes fire." She pushed for an alternative strategy, forming stronger alliances with Europe and Latin America to offset Chinese dominance and creating a global economic coalition based on transparency and shared values. The divide was sharp. America wasn't just debating policy, it was debating ideology. Economic nationalism rises. Beyond the political arena, the American public was changing too. Poll after poll showed an overwhelming shift toward economic nationalism. People wanted products made in the U.S. even if it meant paying more. Buy American campaigns surged across social media. TikTok creators, some who had previously posted fashion hauls, were now showcasing U.S.-made goods and urging followers to support small American businesses. In Detroit, a grassroots movement called Rebuild the Rust Belt gained momentum. Volunteers cleaned up abandoned factories and local investors pledged to reopen them for small-scale production. In Texas, a former oil executive launched an all-American solar panel company, hiring laid-off engineers and technicians to manufacture panels without Chinese parts. These weren't fringe movements, they were becoming a cultural shift. A new generation, a new economic mindset. The retaliation crisis also reshaped how young Americans viewed economics. For years, students were taught the benefits of global free trade. But now, in classrooms and TikTok debates, Gen Z and young millennials were asking, why don't we make our own chips? Why is the U.S. relying on foreign countries for things like medicine? What happens if another country shuts us out? At universities, enrollment in supply chain management programs spiked. Startups focused on American manufacturing. AI-driven logistics and local sourcing gained investor traction. And perhaps most surprisingly, the term economic resilience became more popular than globalization in Google Trends for the first time in 15 years. Tensions at a boiling point. By September 2025, talks between the US and China had stalled completely. Diplomats exchanged sharp statements, and the global press speculated whether the world had entered a new Cold War, an economic Cold War. Tech leaders warned of AI slowdowns due to chip shortages. Farmers worried about missing fertilizer imports. Construction firms panicked over steel rebar delays. Everyone, everywhere, was feeling the pinch. America was standing at a crossroads. Would it emerge more self-reliant and resilient, or isolated and economically bruised? The answer lay in what came next. As the dust settled from the fierce economic exchange between the United States and China, one thing was clear. The world would never return to the old normal. This wasn't just a trade spat, it was a global economic pivot, a reordering of alliances, markets, and mindsets. Across continents, countries, companies, and consumers were redrawing the playbook for survival and success in a post-retaliation era. The new global business map. In the immediate aftermath, some economies struggled while others saw opportunity. Vietnam, India, and Mexico saw a flood of new investment from companies fleeing China. Germany, long known for its advanced manufacturing, began partnering more closely with the US on dual production hubs. African nations, especially those already connected to China through the Belt and Road Initiative, found themselves caught in the middle, offered competing infrastructure deals from both Beijing and Washington. But China didn't retreat. Instead, it doubled down on self-sufficiency. Chinese tech companies like Huawei and BYD began developing homegrown alternatives to US chips and machinery. The Chinese yuan, now accepted in trade deals with Russia, Iran, Brazil, and parts of Africa, began slowly chipping away at the US dollar's global dominance. In short, the world split into economic spheres. One led by the US and its allies, focused on security, democratic supply chains, and transparency. Another centered around China, emphasizing efficiency, sovereignty, and alternative systems. For American businesses and investors, navigating this new dual-world economy became both the challenge and the opportunity of the decade. Who benefited and who didn't? Some industries came out stronger than ever. Domestic manufacturing, from steel to semiconductors, US-based factories saw a revival. Towns that once suffered from offshoring began to boom again. Green energy, with pressure to become less reliant on foreign oil and gas, solar, wind, and battery tech received massive federal investment. Defense and security tech. As economic and geopolitical tensions merged, any technology related to cybersecurity, supply chain tracking, or drone logistics saw explosive growth. But not everyone thrived. Big retail chains, companies built entirely around cheap Chinese imports, like fast fashion and dollar stores, struggled to adapt. Silicon Valley giants, reliant on rare earths and Chinese manufacturing, some tech firms faced profit slashes, delays, and shrinking global market share. Consumers, with rising prices and fewer product choices, American households bore the brunt of inflation and supply shocks, at least temporarily. The rise of the resilient economy. As policymakers across both major parties came to agree on one point, the old dependency model was over, a new vision emerged, resilience capitalism. It wasn't just about free markets anymore. It was about fortified markets. The government didn't just regulate anymore. It actively partnered with the private sector, public-private funds to build rare earth mines and domestic chip foundries, tax credits for businesses hiring American workers, Made in America digital certifications for consumers to easily support local goods. Resilience became a competitive advantage, not just a patriotic ideal. And interestingly, many Americans began to rethink what cheap really meant. A shirt made in the US might cost $10 more, but it supported a neighbor's job, didn't rely on fragile foreign ports, and wasn't subject to sudden embargoes. That mindset shift became the bedrock of a cultural and economic transformation. Final thoughts, a message for the future. So, what does China's retaliation truly mean for US imports and exports? It means we've entered an age where the price of globalization is no longer invisible. Every dependency, every trade route, every foreign handshake carries a cost. It means American business isn't just about profit anymore. It's about preparation. And it means the future will belong to those who can adapt quickly, build locally, and think globally with caution. As one business leader put it at a national supply chain summit, the retaliation shook us, but it woke us up. And now we build smarter. Because in the end, this wasn't just about a battle between two countries. It was about a world forced to wake up, recalculate, and rebuild. And that, my friends, is a story still unfolding.